You've joined us here for this media briefing, which is a slightly different format from our usual forums and workshops that we host. Short COP27 in terms of global dynamics, continental dynamics, and then also in terms of South Africa's climate response. SAIIA does research and policy engagement across a wide range of issue areas that relate to climate change. In fact, we're just reflecting on the fact that there's hardly a component of the Institute's work that is not in some way addressing the climate agenda. So we thought it was certainly an opportune moment then to create this opportunity, this space, for some of our researchers and members of our Youth Policy Committee to engage with journalists and to answer questions. So our structure today is fairly straightforward. We're going to have a series of interventions by SAIIA staff and members of the Youth Policy Committee. Those will be about 7 to 10 minutes. We have an hour session, so we're hoping that we have at least 20 to 30 minutes towards the end for Q&A. I would also remind everyone that there is a wealth of material on the SAIIA website, and it can be searched by thematic area. There is a climate change archive where all the climate change work is brought together. You're also welcome to engage with any of us individually. You can access us through the website, or you can issue a media inquiry through SAIIA. Our email address is on the screen. You can engage with our content on Twitter. So there are a lot of opportunities. Obviously, today's focus is on climate change, but there is really a huge range of issue areas that are addressed through SAIIA's work, and we really do want to encourage you to engage with us. So I'm not going to spend too much time speaking about this. As I said, we all know the COPs that happen every year, the UNFCCC COPs. It's the key global forum for climate action. It's important because not only are countries making commitments in terms of what they are going to do internally in terms of climate action, it also is an opportunity for countries to make commitments in terms of what they would do to help others. And the key dimension there, of course, is to understand what developed countries are committing and are able to do for developing countries which are particularly exposed to climate change impacts and are uniquely vulnerable to climate change impacts and have limited adaptive capacity. So these questions really are key for the Africa region and other developing regions. Critical then also in looking at those commitments is it allows us to look at what has been committed internally and in terms of support and measure those against the models that tell us the climate models that are predicting and measuring both what's happening on the ground now and what's likely to happen in the future. And we saw in the UN emissions gap report that the kind of heat waves, droughts, flooding events that we've been seeing this year and is exacerbated by climate. There's no question in the scientific literature about that. That's driven by simply a 1 degree increase in historic temperatures. And the reality is that we're on the road towards a 2.5 degree increase. Of course, the global goal, what we're all working towards, is to keep that at a maximum to 1.5, but we're simply not on track at the moment. So that really does underline the urgency of these negotiations. So just quickly, in terms of the structure, I'm going to hand over to Romy Chevalier in a moment. She will speak to Africa's COP27 agenda, the more continental perspective. Then we will hear from Joseph Matola from our Economic Diplomacy Program. He will be speaking to climate and macroeconomic policy action post-COVID. Then back to the Climate and Natural Resources Program, my colleague Hannah Sack to present work we've been doing on ecosystems-based adaptation, working with nature to support climate change adaptation. And then we'll be hearing from a group of 4 presenters from the Youth Policy Committee on a recent COP27 Youth Climate Statement for South Africa. So I'm going to hand over now to Romy. Please take it away for us.
Thank you, Alex. If you don't mind, I'm just going to share my screen 1 second. Perfect. Can you see that? Perfect. Welcome, colleagues, and thank you for joining us at this media briefing. As Alex mentioned, I'm a senior researcher on for climate change from SAIIA, and today's focus I'll look at the Africa priorities for COP27. Sorry, something's going on with the screen share. Excuse me 1 second. Oh goodness, guys, sorry. Let me see if I can just move it. Sorry, there's an issue with my screen. Alex, do you want to maybe share the slides for me? They seem to be. Let me see if I can just do that. My functions on my keyboard are not working. Okay, let me stop screen share. Does somebody?
Okay, I think you can get started, and I'll get your screen up in a second.
Okay, perfect. So essentially what I wanted to say was that I'll be looking at the African priorities. Clearly there are, as we know, there are 55 member countries on the African continent with differing priorities going towards the COP. So we can't say that there is a clear agenda for everybody, but the Africa position is aligned on particular climate and development goals. And what I'll try to do today is just highlight some of those key thematic areas that we can watch at COP27 and where the continent is hoping for progress. The other thing I wanted to just say was that I'll start off by saying that COP27 finds itself in an interesting place in terms of the geopolitical dynamics that are happening at the moment. So I'll look at that when the screen comes up. And then I'll also look at some of the continental dynamics that kind of lead us to COP27 and the landscape towards COP27. Right, so some of the geopolitical issues just to keep mind of is obviously and by the way, I'm speaking to a policy insights piece that I've just written, which I'll share with you after this meeting. So for any further explanation on these points, you can refer to that piece. It's up on the SAIIA website. Essentially, we're looking at a very complicated backdrop to COP27, which we hope is not going to in any way kind of change the dynamics of the ambition of countries, although we are seeing that these dynamics are at play and that they are very interesting to watch, and we're hoping that they won't play too much, they won't create too much disarray in the global negotiations for climate change. There's currently a bit of a standoff at the moment between the US and China, and there is some commentary saying that this might have an effect on the working relationship between these countries. We know that the US and China are the world's the largest global emitters, so essentially these countries are key to a global outcome on climate change, and they did develop a working relationship on climate change. So we are hoping that some of the political dynamics between these countries won't have implications for COP27 and their outcomes. Clearly, there's a lot of conversation around energy security and in the context of the Ukraine-Russia conflict. Essentially, a lot of Europe and other countries looking at their energy security issues on the domestic level, and we see some countries revisiting fossil fuels, for example, in their commitments, their energy commitments going forward. So we can look at that. There are obviously some internal politics. So we see some countries, obviously the most recent that being of the UK Prime Minister, saying that these leaders won't be attending COP27 for their own dynamic reasons. So we'll have a look at that if of interest. And some leaders saying that they won't be there. So there's some standoffs in countries and a lot of criticism. But hoping that political momentum is still there. And we always know that in the COP, the first two days of COP is the high level meeting where we see global leaders and other really high political figures going to COP to push key messages. So we hope, and there are a lot of key figures that will be there this year. There's also growing concerns around the location, and it'll be interesting to speak to youth, maybe in the question and answers about this, but Greta Thunberg saying that she won't attend COP this year because of concerns around the Egyptian presidency and issues around human rights and civic liberties. Next, please, Alex. Then obviously on the continent of Africa, as I mentioned, there's different things. Just one back, Alex, please. There's a lot going on, but essentially the African backdrop is many countries obviously have key development and economic constraints that they are worrying about, and obviously energy security constraints as well, and rising prices related to food, fuel, etc. So we are at an interesting position, but countries are nervous around their transition to low carbon trajectories. So I'm going to look at a little bit of energy dynamic going forward. And we also know that there are major social justice concerns and fairness concerns, and justifiably so. Our continent is only responsible for 4% of global emissions, and yet we are bearing the brunt of global impacts. So there's a lot of issues around equity and climate justice, which is the core of our negotiating position. So, and has been for many years, essentially asking the international community to recognize Africa's special circumstances in all COP work streams and across all agendas. Next, please. So there's obviously a variety of topics on the table, many of which are hangovers from previous COPs, also hangovers from COP26, but and these are ongoing discussions, and these are just a few of them. Obviously, in light of time, I won't be able to go into anything today, but I'm going to look at policy actions, so specifically implementation of our national climate policies. Then I'm going to look at the progress on loss and damage and adaptation, which is key to the African continent, given our vulnerability to climate change. Climate finance, which from COP26 has been sort of the elephant in the room, the kind of key to unlocking progress and implementation progress on climate change. And then a just transition, given these kind of energy security dynamics that we're looking at, and then with a key interest on South Africa, obviously pushing the global agenda for just transitions. And then there are other agenda items which we won't speak about today. My colleague Hannah will speak more to nature-based solutions and the role of nature, looking at some countries pushing that on the agenda, obviously given Africa's importance around their natural resources. There's a lot of conversations around agriculture and food systems, which you can ask in question and answer if you're interested in that. Oceans, inclusion of vulnerable people, etc., etc. So let's just go into a couple of these. The first one is national policy action and implementation. Next, please, Alex. So essentially in 2015, when the Paris Agreement was signed, the Paris Agreement calls countries to commit to develop two policy instruments. One, the nationally determined contributions, and the other long-term low emission carbon resilient development strategies, or long-term strategies. The NDCs, which I'm sure you're all aware of, have a trajectory to 2030. And essentially, these are the climate change plans for our countries to 2030. They were initiated and submitted the first round in 2015, and there was a call for them to be revisited every 5 years and strengthened accordingly. At Glasgow, the Glasgow Climate Pact at COP26 called countries to submit a bit earlier than 2025, which was the next iteration, and said in 2022, they wanted to see countries resubmit their NDCs in light of strengthened ambition. Essentially why is to say that NDCs that have been submitted to date by countries globally are not matching what is required by science to limit climate change impacts. So asking countries to strengthen their NDC commitments and to start implementing these commitments. We see that there was a deadline of September, and essentially only 23 countries of the 198 countries that are party to this agreement have updated their NDCs. Many reasons for this, but essentially some of those have had just recently submitted them for COP26, but others that hadn't submitted, like Egypt, Australia, for example, have given us a revised commitment. There's a lot of criticism on these commitments. As I mentioned, they're not ambitious enough, and a lot of the submissions are essentially just iterations of the first submission. So there's no strengthened ambition, and where there are, they often lack detail. That being said, there are some countries that have submitted revised and strengthened NDCs. What is going to happen at this COP is it's essentially going to be the start of something called the global stocktake. Every 5 years, as I mentioned, these NDCs are revisited. But what happens from the beginning of next year is that there's a global stocktake where the UNFCCC looks at the collective body of NDCs and looks to see how ambitious it is, and then essentially says what assesses the NDC implementation and says whether it's ambitious enough and what is needed by science. And this will essentially inform the negotiating agenda going forward. Another question obviously around finance is many of these NDCs are conditional on finance. So with a lot of financing not forthcoming, we don't see many of these NDCs being implemented. And all our countries, for example, in Africa, have costed their NDCs to say this is how much it will cost for the NDC actions to be implemented. And so now we're waiting obviously on the finance to unlock those activities. Then around long-term strategies, essentially they were meant to be submitted in 2020, but because of COVID and many other delays, we see many countries have not managed to submit these officially to the UNFCCC. And these are economy-wide transformation strategies towards net zero. South Africa actually is one of the few African countries that have submitted their long-term strategies back in 2020. And to date, only 5 African countries have actually submitted them officially. And I think Gambia was the most recent, submitting about a month ago. But globally, only 53 have submitted. So we will see in the run-up to COP27 in the next week, plus at COP27, a lot of impetus on ensuring that these commitments are developed and that countries are developing their long-term strategies. Next, please, Alex. Right, so the next outcome, obviously, we're looking for is kind of consensus and progress on the adaptation agenda, and then on loss and damage, which, and they're often hand in hand, essentially looking at the impacts and the vulnerability of our continent. There was an IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, which is obviously the scientific authority on climate change, having released a new report in 2022 to highlight the vulnerability of our continent. The Africa Group for Negotiators, which is the negotiating group for our continent, will be pushing both of these agendas very, very strongly. They want to see balanced commitments between adaptation and mitigation. Historically, many of the COPs have focused a lot on mitigation, and Africa is calling for a revisit and a highlight on adaptation. They also want to see the doubling of adaptation finance and progress made on the global goal for adaptation. So where mitigation, the reduction of carbon dioxide, is easier to monitor and account, there's a lot of question marks around the details around how to measure adaptation. So there's a call for a global goal for adaptation to be implemented and progress to be made on this work stream, which was initiated at COP26. There's also a call to operationalize the Santiago network, which is for loss and damage, essentially looking at assisting developing countries, linking them with the providers for technical assistance, finance, resources, and knowledge, and a dedicated funding arrangement for loss and damage. So essentially, these are things that were initiated at COP26 that we want to see more tangible outcomes at COP27. Next, please, Alex. Climate finance, which I'm sure will be an interesting topic for question and answer, is essentially this, as I mentioned, I called it the elephant in the room at the beginning. It is key to unlocking progress on climate action. So as I mentioned, these NDCs and long-term strategies cannot be implemented without support. And obviously there's a conversation around how much support and countries making unconditional pledges, which is obviously also important. COP27 will push for, obviously, first the fulfillment of historical pledges. So developed countries had promised developing countries a particular amount of financing that has not been met. So it's a call for that. And then obviously for new quantifiable and predictive finance going forward. So they want to see what that roadmap might look like, and they want to see clarity on finance. The Africa Group of Negotiators has developed a collective mobilization goal for climate finance, which you can find online. And essentially, they are calling developed countries to mobilize 1.3 trillion a year by 2030 to support the needs of developing countries. They've asked for 50% of this to go towards adaptation on a grant basis and access through a dedicated facility. And they've also asked for developed countries to adopt a burden sharing agreement, obviously based on responsibilities and capabilities, and ensuring that they commit to their fair share of global finance contributions. Next, please, Alex.
Rams, you'll just have to be
okay, sorry. All right, so
wrapping up.
Okay, perfect. Just transition, which we can speak about. The African Union has come forward with a position on its just energy transition to say that it is going to deploy all energy forms, gas, low carbon, hydrogen, nuclear, etc., in the short and medium term as transitional sources of energy. But they're also looking to uptake renewables and enhance upscaling of renewables in the long term. They are committed to green transition, yet they do see these transitional energy sources as being pertinent to a just and equitable path going forward, universal access to energy and energy security as part of their resilience. There's a lot of concern with activists and NGOs saying that they don't want gas to kind of take over the COP27 agenda. It is something that that obviously will attract a lot of attention, but essentially NGOs are nervous that by placing too much focus on these fossil fuels as transitional fuels, it might undermine the move to renewable energies and also lock Africa into a fossil fuel-based future. Next, please, Alex. South Africa, you would have seen recently with the minister's address, South Africa will be pushing a just transition framework at the COP27, not only for itself, but for Africa more broadly. And it's looking to advocate for the establishment of a people-centered just transition financing framework. It also, as you all know from COP26, it initiated a just energy transition partnership with numerous international donors to attract financing for its just transition. And at COP27, it's looking to unveil its the Just Energy Transition Investment Plan, which was adopted by Cabinet. At this stage, none of us have seen it, but essentially it will be unveiled and it will be open for commentary thereafter. Next, please, Alex. In my last closing slide. Essentially, Africa needs to retain a common position. 55 member countries hold a lot of political weight, and it's very important that African negotiators ensure that the agenda for Africa is, that our continent is aligned in terms of our development needs and objectives and interests. The African Union has recently released a climate change and resilient development strategy and action plan, which outlines the continent's 10-year climate change action priorities. It sets out 8 pathways to say these are the transformative sectors that we can focus on to ensure that we get to climate resilient low carbon economies. So very important that negotiators and countries are looking at this document in a pathway forward. And then essentially to say, despite a regional and global agreement, the onus falls back on member countries to act and drive these agendas domestically. And final points on the next slide, please, Alex, is just in conclusion, what would a successful COP look like for Africa? So there has to be common ground despite these tensions and conflicts. So we cannot detract from the importance of climate change and progress on these climate change agendas that I've mentioned. Climate action, specifically around implementation, needs to be the highest priority on the political agenda for all countries. We need to minimize the gap between what the current pledges are saying and what is needed by science, or Africa obviously stands to lose from being impacted by the adverse effects of climate change. A socially just outcome for developed countries will require financial delivery at its core. And then again, just to reiterate that despite the global agreement, the onus rests on countries to drive these agendas domestically. So thank you for your time and thank you for listening. I will be at COP27, so I'd be happy to get in touch with you if there are any further questions. And please, again, refer to my policy insights piece for further clarity on these points. Thanks, Alex.
Excellent, thank you. Joseph, I'm going to hand over to you. Just a reminder also to keep to time, please.
Okay, thank you, Alex. Let me share my slides. Okay, can you see my slides?
Yes, you just need to go to presentation mode.
Okay, how about that? That's fine, right?
There you go, perfect.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Romy, for a very good presentation. Actually, most of the points that you've touched on overlap with the points that I wanted to drive home. So I'll use that to help me make this as quick as possible. My talk is on Africa's post-COVID climate response. and the key takeaways for COP27. And again, most of this exactly what Romy has proposed, but I want to specifically focus on how the African countries have fared since COVID and COP26, and also how the development partners have also fared in terms of their own commitments. So the background to my talk is that we have done some research. We selected 6 case studies, namely South Africa, Tanzania, Uganda, Nigeria, Senegal, and Benin, and we have looked at how well or not they're incorporating their climate commitments, focusing on what they've indicated in their NDCs, how they're incorporating this into their economic policies, and if there's a proper alignment between their NDC commitments and the development plans, and also whether their legislative environment is also being taken on board. And lastly, we've also looked at the issues of climate financing in these countries, focusing on whether the financing that they have secured is indeed enough to help them achieve their climate commitments. I'll start by looking at the level of mainstreaming of climate commitments that these countries have put into their policies, and also not only their policies but also their action. As you heard Romy before me, that the issue of implementation is also a crucial issue. It's not just about having the policies that reflect climate change. So generally, there's been some alignment, at least in these 6 case studies, between their development plans and their NDCs or their climate commitments. But still, there's a weak translation into action. That is to say, if you look at their budgets, for example, it's not really well reflected. Their commitments are not really, there's a disentanglement there. They're not being really well reflected in their budgets. If you take the example of the COVID stimulus packages that these countries implemented in the immediate aftermath of the COVID, the initial packages that countries were offering to address the economic fallout of COVID. For example, South Africa had the 500 billion rands package. Most of these were essentially climate neutral. That is to say that climate change issues took the backseat. Maybe you can say understandably so, given that at the height of COVID, when it just hit, when lockdowns were just being introduced for the first time, you can understand that maybe the concern was on people's livelihoods than other issues. So essentially, moving forward, after the putting aside the stimulus packages, generally African countries continue to have competing priorities that are derailing their pursuit of just transition, including many African countries. It's not just South Africa, where there's kind of a mismatch between energy demand and energy supply. So these very, very important issues in these countries are kind of derailing the just transition efforts. There's the issue of potential asset stranding, which is also constraining climate change action. There's an example of Senegal. When we looked at Senegal discovered some new fossil fuel deposits, oil and gas, somewhere around 2015, 2016, 2017, thereabout. They have discovered these assets, but what we're saying, the world as a whole, we're saying we need to move away from this, and this will become really a very valuable assets, but stranded. So this is one area which needs to be looked at, because it has a potential for derailing the climate efforts. And indeed, if you look at Senegal, for example, they went back to their INDCs, which they had submitted in 2015 or 16 thereabout, and kind of incorporated these new oil discoveries, and essentially making their updated NDCs less ambitious. So this is a really big issue on the stranded assets. And also another crucial issue that we have seen is the capacity in terms of establishing measurement, reporting, and verification mechanisms. So most African countries simply cannot track their emissions. The capacity is really lacking on that aspect. So this is also another issue that has not been effectively mainstreamed into policies and actions. The issue of climate change legislation, this one is, maybe we can say it's a half-half, because we have had some positive developments, like in countries like Uganda and Nigeria. Both of them, they enacted their climate change acts in 2021, and they came into effect. But maybe on the not so positive side, we can take the example of South Africa. Of course, hopefully very soon the climate change bill will be assented and will come into effect. But it's been more than 3.5 years since its initial publication, and it's been a slow process, but hopefully very, very soon. If now going into the other issue of climate financing, I think this is a point that Romy has also made quite clearly. I want to emphasize that it is in these 6 case studies, pretty much all of them, it is the feeling that the commitments that have been made, that it is the feeling that, one, it is absolutely very crucial that the development world step up their game in terms of providing climate financing, but not just in terms of increasing their commitments, but also fulfilling these commitments. So, so on one hand, the current levels of commitments are not to the levels that are required, but also the fulfillment of these commitments has been an issue. On that table, you can see the requirements. You can see the actual financial requirements from the external partners that these countries require. South Africa is somewhere around 8 billion per year. Uganda is somewhere around 24 billion. Like for Uganda, that's total. Senegal 8.2 billion, Benin 4.9 billion, Tanzania 18.4 billion, and Nigeria 10 billion per year. So Nigeria and South Africa, these are paid annually. The others is the total that is being required, and most of this have yet to be fulfilled. Yes, South Africa, they did secure that 8.5 billion, but that's just the beginning, and it hopefully and it's still being negotiated, and hopefully we'll secure more. But I also wanted to emphasize that much as it was reported in 2020, for example, that 83.3 billion of the 100 billion commitment was fulfilled. This represents 83.3%. But other research from other institutions like Oxfam, they believe the actual the true value that has been given to African countries is much less than that. For example, if you take the public financing, if you subtract the private investment that come into Africa, if you just look at the public financing, I think OECD had reported that 68.3 billion had been channeled to Africa, but according to Oxfam estimates, the actual grant component is only 21 billion to 24.5 billion out of the 68 billion. And if you look at Madrajo development banks, about 71% of the funds are in form of loans that will need to be repaid. And the grant component is somewhere around 26% only. And this is a very big challenge for Africa, especially in the context of the rising debt that many countries are facing. So our takeaways for COP28, sorry, I'm way ahead of myself. For COP27, for African countries, there's still work that needs to be done in terms of mainstreaming the NDCs into the policies. Although there's been some great progress, however, it is the translation into actual action that is most important, and this is really lagging. And also for African countries, they must enact their climate change laws as soon as possible to provide a legal backing for the climate change action. For international partners, it's mainly the main message we want to take away is about financing, not just they need to increase their commitment as of now, but also they need to fulfill them and consider the issue of asset stranding, because these are resources that poor countries could have used, but understandably we don't want to exploit them because of the climate implications. So this needs to be reflected in the commitments, financial commitments that the developed world is going to offer to African countries. The issue of adaptation financing, I think Romy has touched on that. And lastly, the most important, another important issue is African countries need help in capacity building on the measuring, reporting, and verification systems, and this needs to be prioritized, and the developed world needs to help and step in. I'll stop here, Alex. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joseph. I'm going to hand over to Hannah now. I can already see that our plan to have a decent Q&A session is not going to materialize. I would say to those attending, please do take note of your questions. We could perhaps squeeze in one or two towards the end of the session, but I'm sure that that's not going to be adequate. So again, probably just a reminder to take this chance to note down your questions, and you can of course approach us for follow-up interviews or questions of clarification. You can contact us through SAIIA or through the contact details available on the website. I'll recap that towards the end of the session as well, but I just want to recognize at this point that I think that we will not have much of a Q&A session as we'd planned. Hannah, you can take it forward for us.
Thanks, Alex. Good morning, everyone. I'm Hannah. I work as a climate change researcher at SAIIA, and yeah, I'll be talking a little bit on how working with nature can contribute towards climate adaptation and resilience, with a specific focus on Africa now in the lead up to COP27. So as Romy mentioned before, a lot of the negotiations at COP previously have focused a lot on mitigation, but now in the lead up to the Africa COP, we know that adaptation has been on Africa's agenda, both politically as well as for financial support, with the continent only contributing about 4% towards global emissions, yet experiencing some of the most devastating effects of climate change, as we've seen from the floods this year in Durban. We also know that in Africa, many communities rely directly on natural resources for their livelihoods and sustenance. So now moving forward to COP27 and then later COP15 for the Convention of Biological Diversity, which is happening in December, it provides quite an ample opportunity to really try and leverage financial support for adaptation, but particularly looking at nature-based solutions. My key takeaway message from today essentially is that by preserving, restoring, and protecting nature, human well-being, biodiversity, and climate resilience can be enhanced. And this can be achieved through incorporating nature-based solutions and ecosystem-based adaptation into nationally determined contributions. For the purpose of today's presentation, I don't think it's too important to really get stuck into the details of these definitions. I think what's important to just understand is that nature-based solutions is kind of your umbrella term for incorporating nature for societal benefit, where EBA has more of a climate, I guess, connotation to it, and of course focuses on adaptation as opposed to mitigation. And what makes EBA different from other traditional forms of adaptation is that it seeks to contribute to these three outcomes simultaneously. So that is, of course, climate adaptation, socioeconomic and human well-being benefits, as well as biodiversity conservation and restoration. So in the Venn diagram on the screen, you can kind of see how all of these three things interplay with one another. And it's these co-benefits that work simultaneously that really make EBA quite an attractive investment. And often through initiatives such as reforestation, carbon sequestration, and therefore mitigation co-benefits can be realized as well. We've also seen that last year at COP26, it was kind of the first time that nature really made it quite significantly onto the COP agenda. And from that, we've also seen quite a few political movements, both globally and regionally, on incorporating nature into climate change initiatives. So according to a study by WWF, in 2021, approximately 105 out of 114 countries had included some form of nature-based solutions into their NDC revisions. At COP26, we also saw 130 countries pledge to reverse and halt deforestation by 2030 through the signing of the Glasgow Leaders Declaration on Forest and Land Use. Then with regards to marine and coastal environments, we also saw the launch of the Great Blue Wall Initiative, which aims to conserve 30% of marine area coverage by 2030 in the Western Indian Ocean. And then finally, the Glasgow Climate Pact, which was the key decision document coming out of COP26, recognized the importance of nature through protecting, conserving, and restoring ecosystems, both looking at terrestrial ecosystems, so your forests, but then also looking at marine and coastal ecosystems, as well as their importance to act as sinks and reservoirs for greenhouse gases. So this then leads me into my next point, which is really that coastal and marine ecosystems are just as, and not maybe if more, vitally important for adaptation specifically in Africa, and then also generally have quite an important mitigation co-benefit as well. But despite their significant value, we also know that the ocean is extremely important for absorbing a lot of the heat generated through carbon emissions. These ecosystems continue to be degraded through overexploitation and pollution. We've also seen that marine and coastal ecosystems are still largely absent from climate response measures, and they need to be more fully integrated into national and sectoral policies. Then looking particularly at Africa, the coastal communities are extremely fast growing, highly populated, and are extremely exposed to climate change threats. So just for an example, Cyclone Idai in Mozambique in 2019 caused much devastation. Many people lost their lives in the coastal city of Beira. So this is just one example of how coastal communities really are exposed to this onset of increased frequency and intensity of extreme disasters like cyclones, like flooding, and even sea level rise. Building on this, SAIIA, our climate change team, we've done quite significant work actually looking at marine and coastal ecosystem-based adaptation in Southern Africa. So coming out of a project that we did in 2019, where we looked at ecosystem-based adaptation in the marine and coastal ecosystems of 4 SADC states, we found some significant findings. So at a very high level, what we found was that there was a general lack of inclusion of EBA in the policies of these coastal countries. So just to reiterate, it was Tanzania, Seychelles, South Africa, and Mozambique were our key focus countries for this project. We also found that there was a lack of regional cooperation amongst member countries to manage and protect their ecosystems. And we also found that there was an absence of a regional vision and ambition in national climate policies and NDCs. So then building kind of out of this work, currently we're implementing a project looking more broadly at marine and coastal EBA in the 10 SADC coastal and island countries. And through this, aiming to build a community of practice to share knowledge amongst a range of stakeholders throughout the region on how to really upscale marine and coastal EBA, both into national climate responses, as well as regional responses, but also then on the ground sort of projects incorporating local and indigenous knowledge as well. Leading up to COP27, this is also important. We've actually drafted a project statement, which Romy will be taking, which outlines some key recommendations for policymakers to hopefully get marine and coastal EBA on the negotiating table at COP27. However, to make EBA successful, it really does require political buy-in, innovative financing, as well as participatory governance. So without EBA kind of being mainstreamed into climate change policy, which is generally the case, or it's included at an extremely high level, there often is this lack of buy-in and commitment from government to actually implement EBA initiatives. However, in saying that, because of the co-benefits that working with nature through EBA offers, it does actually provide quite an attractive adaptation option. So we know that barriers to finance is widely noted by many stakeholders throughout the region. So kind of leveraging these co-benefits from EBA really can help to upscale adaptation on the continent. We've also seen that EBA does require innovative financing schemes like payment for ecosystem services and debt for nature swaps. And then finally, and quite importantly, local community engagement needs to be incorporated into EBA planning from the inception. Because you're essentially working with nature and ecosystems, local communities that rely on these ecosystems for their livelihoods often have the knowledge needed to successfully implement an EBA project. At the same time, these livelihoods need to be safeguarded and necessarily should not be foregone in the sake of climate resilience as well. But just to reiterate, EBA provides a range of co-benefits contributing to social economic growth, biodiversity conservation, and climate change adaptation. But in order for this to be successful and upscaled, the inclusion of EBA into NDCs really is quite critical. NDCs provide your long-term sort of plan for national climate change response in your country. So in order to really leverage the finance necessary to upscale adaptation and to work with nature, contributing to those co-benefits, your NDCs are quite critical. And we're hoping that this really will come out quite clearly at the Africa COP later this year. Thanks.
Fantastic, thank you. All right, so we really are short on time, so I want to hand over to the Youth Policy Committee. Policy Committee is a group that emerged out of SAIIA's youth activities. We have a program called Youth at SAIIA, but is also broader than that body itself, and includes young people from across the country doing really fantastic work, engaging on policy debates at several levels. Indeed, two of the speakers we're hearing from in a moment will also be at COP27. So I'm not sure if I've got the order right, but names here are Hajir Ajumati, Tabiseng Mabetela, Kachelo Kumbeni, and Kapano Moraka. Over to you. As you see, we are up against it in terms of time. I said in the beginning, it's going to be 10 minutes. Well, it really is going to have to be 10 minutes. So do keep an eye on the time as you work through your presentation.
Is the PowerPoint sharing?
Yes, it is.
Okay,
I can see it, yeah.
Good morning, everybody. So we, the Youth of South Africa, encouraged by the mandate of the South African Constitution to ensure protection and conservation of the environment, balanced with sustainable development, and the equitable distribution of natural resources, recognize the urgent need for accelerated climate action to build a self-actualized, climate resilient, and prosperous society. The statement reflects the above mandate by highlighting the voices of the South African the youth who see a future of a greener, cleaner South Africa and world. Considering the upcoming negotiations taking place in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, we'd like to put forward the following recommendations that align with the goals set out for COP27. Firstly, for intersectionality falling under adaptation and resilience. We recognize and appreciate all national and international efforts made to emphasize and mainstream the relationship between gender and climate change, as these are two cross-cutting issues that need to be addressed. Furthermore, we reaffirm the Paris Agreement's common but differentiated responsibility values regarding equitable action to climate change based on various intersectional and socioeconomic factors. We therefore call for equitable sharing of resources such as finance, knowledge, and technologies, and acknowledge the global and economic disparities that exist and call for solutions to cater to this. Next, in terms of stakeholder participation, we applaud the South African government on the recent strides in increasing youth participation in international climate change meetings by including and adopting youth delegates to their delegation to attend COP conferences. We support the strengthening of youth voices from global South countries at international decision-making tables and stress the need for the involvement of women, youth, and those from marginalized communities in the entirety of the decision-making process of international policies and frameworks. Additionally, we implore the international government to take on a zero-tolerance policy concerning the breaking of environmental laws from relevant stakeholders. Then, with regards to capacity building, we call for increased implementation and monitoring of climate change education, and moreover, we encourage accessible media. Lastly, under loss and damage, we are calling for recognized relief centers to be better equipped with the tools and resources in preparation for unforeseen natural disasters, and recommend that carbon footprints be calculated and updated promptly to inform decision-making processes, thus preventing irreparable damage.
In addition, we urge for enhanced financing. I will be speaking with regards to mitigation and technology, enhanced financing, equitable distribution, and strategic application of conservation and sustainable farming technology. We further stress the need for investment into research to better understand and develop carbon dioxide removal and solar radiation management technologies. We then call for urgent investments into renewable energy technologies that can be made affordable and accessible to fuel-reliant economies that would otherwise be unable to contain a mixed balance of energy sources. Furthermore, we then strongly recommend an increase in carbon tax for companies that are over-emitting greenhouse gases and stress the importance of reinvesting funds collected into community-based initiatives that focus on mitigation and adaptation. We propose the establishment of public and private sector carbon index with the associated rating of companies and the products based on environmental and humanitarian practices and carbon outputs with incentivized opportunities for those that are compliant. In addition, we call for the
it seems Kahelo is interrupted. Could one of the other presenters maybe take over?
Kupano, you're going to go in?
Sure thing. So for, can I just go back to the slides? For climate technology, we call for parties to end new investments on fossil fuels to raise ambition towards increasing renewable energy investments. Can I have the next slide, please? One more top by, okay, thank you so much. For water biodiversity and wildlife, we express our appreciation for the effective practice of the blue economy to monitor the growth of the population of all marine life and to stabilize global oceanic systems. And we further urge for stricter laws within the international community on animal poaching, trade, and ownership. And ownership of wild and endangered species. For agriculture, we urge for the use of natural fertilizers and growth stimulants to reduce genetically modified organisms to promote ecologically and sustainable farming. And we also recommend large-scale alternative farming methods such as vertical farming, which is aeroponics, hydroponics, and what is this? Hydroponics and aquaponics to stimulate and to cultivate mainland farming. On waste management, we would like to call on a ban for single-use plastic with a complete phase out by the year 2050, in line with the legally binding plastic agreement established at UNEA 5.2. And we encourage for greater collaboration within the informal waste market picketers, who are responsible for over 90% of the recycling that occurs within city centers, to provide them with essential skills and recycling to grow their entrepreneurial businesses. I see that Kachelo's back. I'm not sure if she wants to take over or if I should just continue.
It's okay, you can continue.
Okay, thank you so much. And on the last point for waste management, we want to highlight the urgency and the need for collaboration between researchers, businesses, and government stakeholders to build biomass power stations that will provide renewable energy in a clean and green, environmentally friendly manner. If I can just go over to systemic transformation, I think in an effort to drive a systemic transformation, we must champion the need for equitable, swift, and just transition. And this is one that really moves from highly centralized energy production dependent on fossil fuels towards decarbonized, decentralized production of clean, renewable energy. And to achieve a green and circular economy, we therefore call for stricter regulations that put pressure on manufacturers to increase producers that are sustainable and that will grow at ease for the entry of a circular economy. And without fail, we also call on, I think we also emphasize on the ban for the single-use plastic by 2050, which is, feeds well into the circular economy and to waste management as well. And then in addition to for a just transition, we express our concern for a lack of sufficient observation and data in the global south that enables scientists to study climate trends to make accurate and informed policy decisions. And this is why we call for an increased investment in building more observation stations within the global south countries to better understand the trends and to be able to better predict future impacts of climate change. Additionally, we are also very concerned about the potential privatization of electricity production, and the supply. And for this reason, we would like to call for a clear, ethical regulation between Competition Commission, government, IPPs, which are independent power producers, to prioritize clean, green, stable, and affordable electricity supply to all South Africans at large. For the energy sector, we solemnly reaffirm the need for government to strengthen efforts towards increasing investment for the mobilization of natural resources such as wind, solar, hydropower towards a just transition energy shift. And in the statement, we also call urgently for the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy to end all fossil fuel investments and urge the international community to accelerate the development of technologies and adaptation policies towards low carbon emission systems, including rapidly scaling up the deployment of clean power generation and energy sufficient measures. And lastly, under transport for a systemic transformation, we would want to reemphasize the need for improvements in the safety and efficiency of public transport. And we highlight the need for increasing fuel efficiency on transport services, as well as the implementation of green powered public transportation. And lastly, we want to further recommend the fiscal charges and taxes relating to per capita use of transport services be restructured over long-term periods, so that each mode of transport and each mode and sector of transport pays the total cost of their impact on the environment, so that it's spread equally. And I'll now move it over to Ntabiseng for climate finance.
Thank you so much. Regarding climate finance, we urge developed countries to urgently reaffirm and meet their climate finance commitments to jointly mobilize $100 billion per year for developing countries to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. We encourage relevant providers of financial support to consider how vulnerability to the adverse effects of climate change could be reflected in the provision and mobilization of concessional financial resources, and how they could simplify and enhance access to finance, noting the importance of monitoring, evaluation, and due diligence. We stress that information about the financing bodies and pathways are made public and transparent, with specific reasons for how and why such funds have been approved for their respective sectors, in order to allow the public to track the mobilization of funds. We raise concerns on the condition and restriction regarding international financial programs aimed at assisting developing countries where, one, the number of mobilized funds does not meet the requirement to equally mitigate and adapt to the impacts of climate change, and two, the structure of these funds consists of loans that need to be paid back with unreasonable interest rates, creating national debt and counteracting financial measures put in place to combat climate change. We thank you so much for listening to our presentation, and we note that more than 200 youth participants contributed to this youth statement, and we really wish we were left with more time to go in depth on our youth statement. Thank you.
I'm also just going to add that this youth statement, the complete youth statement, can be found online, which I will share a link for shortly, so that everybody is able to access and read what the youth of South Africa are saying. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks so much. As you saw, I think immense thought gone into that very comprehensive and inclusive statement, and it's important that that gets all the exposure we can give it. So just to mention, then, there are several publications that really form the basis of what you've heard in this presentation. And what we'll do on our end later today is share links. All those publications are available at the moment on the SAIIA website, but just to make it a little bit easier, we will share links with all the participants, including to the COP statement, which you also see there in the chat. We unfortunately don't have much time. I mean, officially we are at the end of the hour that we'd allocated for ourselves. So I don't really think we're going to be able to get into much content questions. If there are any questions of clarification, please do raise those. I don't see, you can just indicate by a raised hand or put a question into the chat or the Q&A. But while we see if any of those questions emerge, again, just a reminder, I think the important element here was to give you a sense, a flavor of the depth and the breadth of work being done by SAIIA on these climate change issues, and again, to really encourage all of you, all members of the media, to reach out to us through our media team, or directly to us through the website. And as I said when we opened for this event, tutorial and insights being made available through the SAIIA website. So I don't see any questions. And again, apologies for not providing adequate time really for discussion. But a big thank you for joining us today. And thank you to all of my colleagues and members of the Youth Policy Committee for their presentations and their efforts today. Yes, I do see there's Hajar. You can quickly jump in.
I just want to say really quickly that this statement was kind of built off of the South African Youth Climate Action Plan, the SAIIA, which can be accessed at www.saiycap, so that's ycap.org. And I think it's just very important that we instead of just saying that we're not just writing up another statement, we are building off of something that is existing, something that is very relevant, and something that already has encompassed everything, and we're working on an implementation strategy now.
Absolutely, thank you for that. And indeed, as I mentioned when I introduced the Youth Policy Committee, you know, these statements are not documents sitting on a shelf. I know for a fact that the Youth Policy Committee has been engaging in several dialogues with policymakers and really has the ear of government and policymakers at several levels. So it really is exciting to see the work being done at that or through that initiative. So at this stage, I'm going to close the meeting with a final thank you to everyone.
I think we've lost Alex, unless it's just me. Okay, I'll take over from him to bid everyone a good day and a farewell, and thank you for all the presenters for your contributions. And yes, please, to the journalists in the room, you're welcome to contact us individually, and you're welcome to reach out to myself and some of the youth colleagues who will be at COP27 for interviews while we're there as well. We'll be following certain agenda items and participating in certain discussions, so we're willing, to share those thoughts with you as well. So thanks so much. Thanks to the SAIIA team for hosting us today, and close this meeting. All right. Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us.
Bye, everybody. Thanks, guys.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, Joseph.
Yes. Bye.
Joseph, we don't overlap. I never realized. So cheers, Alex. Okay, wait, I'm going to phone you. I'll speak to you later. Alex was busy calling me.